Hello, welcome to Sociology and this lesson, which is forming part of the Paper 1 Education scheme of learning. Specifically, this is Social Class and Achievement, Part 2, because as you should be aware, we've already covered Part 1 in the lessons in the classroom, where we looked at the factors that affected achievement based on whether or not students are from the working class or the middle class. And just to kind of recap on some of that, if you remember, we started with a quotation from former Education Secretary Michael Gove, who made this rather contentious and purposefully kind of bold, if you like, claim that rich, thick kids will do better than poor, clever kids even before they start school. So, of course, that opened up a discussion for a lot of what we did before, but it's important to remind ourselves that whilst he might be framing that in a rather contentious and provocative way, the essence and the truth of what he said actually remains true throughout education, and it's the reason why we study this, and it's the reason why a lot of sociologists will go on and research this, and many people who then go into policy would like to fix this, because the truth is that if you're from a middle class background, you do stand a much better chance of succeeding than your working class peers. What I've put up in front of you might seem like a kind of fairly boring looking chart. What this actually represents is something called the Disadvantage Gap Index, okay, which is measured every year. What this is a way of measuring how big the difference in GCSE results between what's referred to as disadvantaged students. Usually this is measured by, for example, those who have been eligible for free school meals and all other students, so students who are not considered to necessarily be disadvantaged. Instead of just looking at the grades themselves, what the index does is it ranks every student in the country and then compares the average position of disadvantaged students to everyone else. So in other words, the bigger the gap, the bigger the number, the bigger the gap. And this is measured every year to see how big that gap is. At the moment, currently in the UK, the number is 3.9, okay, and that's for Key Stage 4 GCSEs. Now, the Key Stage 4 disadvantage gap index widened due to COVID when it moved from 3.84 to 3.95. Now, that doesn't sound very big as a change, but what that represented was that COVID essentially set back the fight for equality in education by about 10 years. And we're only just now starting to make its way down again. So COVID had a huge impact for that on that. And it's actually something we talked about when we discussed the external factors that have an impact on achievement. What this whole chart means overall is that on average, disadvantaged students are almost 4 whole rank positions lower than other students when you were to line up all the GCSE results nationally. In simple terms, the higher the number, the more unequal the outcomes. A lower number would mean that the gap between disadvantaged students and those from a non-disadvantaged background would be closing. So that's a little bit complicated. Perhaps a more simple and straightforward way of looking at the kind of things that we're talking about here is the percentage of students that would achieve a grade 5 in both GCSE maths and English compared to their disadvantaged peers or those with a disadvantaged status. So on the right hand side, the orange blocks will show us the students that are likely to, number of students or the percentage of students achieving that grade 5 or above in both GCSE and maths. Okay, in the blue, those to be known as disadvantaged students, that's through financial income. Okay, so we can see the huge difference between those who are from a disadvantaged background compared to those who aren't. Okay, it's really, really clear just how significant the difference is. So what we've looked at so far, as I mentioned before, are the external or the structural explanations, how someone's social class and also their lack of material capital or cultural attitudes have shaped the achievement. All of these explanations that we've looked at come from outside both of the individual and the classroom. You're born into language, that structures your attitudes to things. You're born into a family. Their passed down attitudes shape how you see education and the wider world. Okay, so if you remember, we looked at theories such as Basil Bernstein and Sugarman in all these ideas. Unemployment or low pay may lead to a lack of money and material things. Again, the economy is outside of you. However, structuralist theorists see behaviour as a kind of robotic, mechanistic thing. You do not have the agency or free will to think about your behaviour. You do things automatically. And that's why we must consider the internal factors. The idea is that actually not all of the reasons why there is a gap between attainment and achievement across the classes comes from class culture or material deprivation, but actually the school system itself, and in particular schools. So in this lesson we're going to be studying 4 different areas. We're going to be looking at labelling theory, which informs streaming and something called self-fulfilling prophecies. And we're also going to be looking at class identities as well. Now, the first thing to consider and the first thing to fill in your booklets is how we come about these studies. Unlike the studies that were done about external factors that have an impact on educational achievement, most of the studies that we're going to be looking at here are using interactionism, okay, which is a branch of social action theory. Interactionists, so many of the people who have done the studies we're going to talk about today, look at small-scale social interaction and what it means for those taking part in it. They look at how they use language and free will and agency to make active choices and the effect this has on that small-scale situation. And because they're small-scale research projects, interactionists are really much more interested in qualitative data. And in a roundabout way, you can see this as being kind of the opposite of structural theories such as functionalism and, of course, traditional Marxism. So now we know how this research was conducted and the perspective that the theorists that write this are coming from. We can look at some of the specific theories themselves. And we're going to start with what's known as labelling theory. Now, to label someone means to attach a meaning or a definition to them. For example, teachers may label a pupil as bright or thick, a troublemaker or hardworking. And studies show that teachers can often attach these labels without really any basis in a student's actual ability or their attitude. Instead, these labels can be based on stereotyped assumptions that come exclusively from their class background. What the impact of this is that it often results in working class students being labelled negatively and middle class students being labelled positively. Now, labelling's been researched by interactionist sociologists in the sort of small-scale studies I mentioned before. And the aim is to discover how labelling occurs and, of course, what the effects of this are. And many of these studies are really based around what teachers tend to perceive as being the ideal pupil. So have a think. What qualities do you think teachers tend to attach or associate with the idea of an ideal pupil? Well, you might have said things like being polite as being something that teachers look for in an ideal pupil. Being smart, and what I mean by that is sort of smartly dressed, adhering to the uniform policy of a particular educational institution. Someone who's punctual and ready to learn, abiding by the sort of times, that turning up for school, seeming keen, having all the correct equipment and so on. Someone who follows the rules would be an ideal pupil, not someone you have to challenge the behaviours of or kind of complete any additional work because the rules aren't being followed. Someone who's articulate, who can have conversation, ask questions, respond to questions, be able to explain themselves and other processes. Obviously, most teachers would see someone who completes homework as an ideal pupil. And of course, something beyond what the pupil themselves has controls of, but most teachers would agree that an ideal pupil is a pupil that has parents that are supportive of the school and the work they're doing. Now, already you should be able to see how many of these factors are actually not associated with educational ability or attitude really themselves at all, but you should also be able to see how many of these things actually may come from the cultural capital of students' parents. And already we can see that we know that middle class pupils are much more likely to have these qualities because of their parents or the environment they've grown up in. But what we're looking at is how the teachers labelling these students as the ideal student and those who aren't ideal students can be affected by positive or negative labelling. So there are 3 case studies to look at here. And the first one is from Howard Becker. He interviewed 60 teachers in Chicago. Most of these were in inner city environments, so there was a mixed social class of both working class and middle class students. The pupils' ability was determined on the basis of their appearance. Teachers tended to, what we might say, read the pupils. As middle class children always presented in the kind of best way, they were considered the ideal pupils. And therefore what happened is that teacher expectations play an important role in dictating who would succeed and who would fail. In other words, teachers treated the students differently based on whether they perceived them as being an ideal student or not, and that came almost exclusively from their appearance, which I'm sure you'll agree isn't very fair. Our second case study is from Mairead Dunn and Louise Gaisley in 2008. They were looking specifically in state schools in England. What they found was that teachers actually kind of normalised underachievement if it was from working class students, treating it as something that really they had nothing control over, nothing that could be done. By contrast, when it came to underachievement in middle class students, this was something to be concerned about, something that needed fixing, if you like. Part of all this was assuming that the parents of the working class parents were less supportive or wouldn't necessarily be interested, therefore why bother trying to help them? And the overall result was in differences in how students were treated and perceived, such as students from a working class background were underestimated, and students from middle class backgrounds would have been maybe entered into higher exams where they had the potential to achieve greater results. The third case study on this one was from Ray Rist. Working in America, he studied the kindergartens, so that's the kind of below primary school, in about 1970. A teacher placed children in separate groups and on separate tables based on the children's appearance and their home background, which by today's standards sounds incredibly unfair and discriminatory, doesn't it? The pupils that the teacher described as faster learners were given the name the Tigers. They were the neater students, they were seated nearer to the teacher and therefore got more attention, and unsurprisingly, these were the middle class students. The other groups, who were put further away, were labelled as the Cardinals, or, rather disturbingly, the Clowns, and these were the groups that were sat further away. They were given lower ability tasks and actually less opportunities to interact with the teacher, and these, again, unsurprisingly, tended to be from more working class backgrounds. So you can see how labelling might have an impact on children or exactly how it happens. But this idea was taken further to add a concept which is known as self-fulfilling prophecy. So as I said, the impact of labelling in the classroom can be that students will underachieve simply because of the prediction that's been made about them, not because they're less able, but because they are following what's known as a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it can occur in a kind of process that might look a bit like this. Step 1, a teacher labels the pupil based on their appearance or their parents or their background, and they use this information to make predictions about their future, i.e. what grades they'll get, how well they achieve. Step 2, the teacher then treats the pupil as if that prediction will come true. They're given maybe less attention if they're from a working class background, or they have the appearance of someone who won't do as well. And those who are part of that ideal student will get more attention, expecting them to complete higher levels of work and completing more work. And then thirdly, the pupil will internalise the teacher's expectations, which then becomes part of their own self-concept and self-image. So they become the kind of pupil that the teacher believes them to be and acts accordingly. So they basically live up to what the teacher believes because the teacher has been treating them in such a way. And there have been studies done into this one as well, most famously Rosenthal and Jacobson. These were two researchers who conducted some research, was a little bit cheeky. They told teachers at a California primary school that they had got a new test which was designed to identify pupils who would be spurters, jump ahead, race ahead of the crowd. But it wasn't true. The test was just simply a standard IQ test. But the teachers believed what they'd been told, that this incredible test would reveal who the best pupils were. So the researchers tested the pupils, but picked about a fifth of them, 20%, at random, and labelled these as the students that would be the spurters. So basically they applied their fake test to them and told their teachers, these are the ones you want to look out for, these are the ones that are going to be racing ahead. But of course, they were exactly at the same level as everybody else. When Rosenthal and Jacobson returned to the school a year later, they found that nearly half of the imagined spurters had made significant progress. So what Rosenthal and Jacobson suggest was that the teachers held these newly held but yet false beliefs about the pupils, had been influenced by the supposed test. Results changed and the way they interacted with the students, making the prophecy come true. So we can look at it in what's known as a kind of Pygmalion effect, whereby the way that you are treated has an impact on the way that you treat other people, and that has an impact on their perception of you, and their perception of you has an impact on how you see yourself, and then how you behave and treat other people, and the way you treat other people affects how they see you, and the cycle goes round and round and round. So if you are treated differently, your self-perception changes, you treat other people how you think you should based on what that label has been. And of course that stops that cycle being broken. Another aspect of labelling theory, which is perhaps a little bit less to do with the individual teacher and more about the systems within a school, is something called streaming, which most of you will probably be familiar with because it's used in a lot of schools in the UK. But to give you a kind of working definition of this, basically streaming involves separating children into different ability groups, and we call these streams or sometimes sets. Each ability group is then taught separately from the others for all subjects. And studies show that streaming is likely to result in self-fulfilling prophecies. No real surprises there. But what kind of compounds this or makes this worse is the fact that working class pupils are less likely to be seen ideal. Pupils and teachers will have lower expectations of them and put them in lower streams. And once they're in this stream, it's very difficult to move between them. Working class pupils tend to be locked in to those teachers' low expectations, whilst middle class students just enjoy the benefits of being stretched and challenged in those higher streams without having to worry about being moved down. To make it even worse, the studies done by Gilborn and Udall, who basically found that there was a kind of A to C economy that made streaming have a greater impact. So this is what they did. They studied 2 London secondary schools. They found that teachers are less likely to see the working class and the black students in the group as having abilities based on perceived perceptions and sort of a stereotyped view. And therefore they'd end up in those lower streams, which denies them the ability to close the gap on their middle class peers. Furthermore, they link this to the policies of exam tables being published, where schools are ranked according to their performance. So for Gilborn and Yodel, this leads to this A to C economy in schools, where in a bid to get higher rankings in the league tables, which is very important for schools to get funding, the schools will place most of their time, effort and resources into those students who are more likely to get grade C, which is the level 4 and above. Gilborn and Udell refer to this process as a kind of educational triage. So it's a sort of sorting process. The term triage itself comes from medical contexts, such as in a war zone or in a busy accident and emergency, where triage is done to assess and sort out who the most serious cases are. And this happens in education as well. So this diagram kind of neatly describes what's going on here. So if we think of the fact that you've got the ideal pupils who are placed in the sets, the higher sets, the middle to higher sets, okay, and the school will concentrate on them so that they get those 5 A to C's that's so important for getting them up the ladders and the league tables and so on. Meanwhile, because of labelling, working class and black students end up in the lower streams, and because it's determined that they're less likely to get a grade 4 or 5, no one bothers with them, okay? Lower pupil streams are seen as unlikely to benefit the school, and so they're kind of left to their own devices, whilst the more middle class elements are pushed and helped and supported. So again, a bit like the Pygmalion effect, this is quite cyclical, isn't it? This is very difficult for students to break free of their the disadvantages. And of course, anything that we can talk about relating to marketisation or the life of the school outside of its job, if you like, as a school, and where it comes into policy. So we can relate this to the marketisation and school policies and stuff that we'll be studying later on in the course. So keep that in mind. So one other aspect that comes from labelling is something referred to pupil subcultures. And we've already kind of had a little bit of look at this when we discussed how working class subcultures can breed, if you like, a kind of ideological connection between people. This was the work of Sugarman, who was looking at the kind of qualities and attitudes held by working class subcultures. But this can happen in school as well. So just to remind you, a pupil subculture is a group of pupils who share similar values and behavioural patterns. Now, pupil subcultures can often emerge and as a response to the way pupils have been labelled, and in particular as a reaction to how they're streamed as well. Sociologist Colin Lacey looks at 2 different processes that can happen within schools, and they explain how pupil subcultures develop. So what you find is there are 2 processes, one called differentiation, which is about the process of teachers categorising pupils according to how they perceive their ability, their attitudes and their behaviours. Streaming is a form of this kind of differentiation because it puts people into different groups, but along with this comes a level of status. High status for those who are selected for the high streams and inferior status for those who are in the low streams. But differentiation isn't the only process. What this results in is polarisation. And polarisation is the process in which pupils respond to their streaming by moving towards one of 2 opposite poles or extremes. So Lacey's studies lead him to find that the streaming for polarised boys in a pro-school are pro-school and anti-school subcultures. So your streaming basically can make you feel polarised, and that will push you towards an anti-school subculture. Before we look at the anti-school subculture, let's concern ourselves with the pro-school subculture. And it's, as it sounds, students who are in the higher streams, who are largely from that middle class background as we discussed, tend to remain committed to the values of the school. They gain their status in improved manners by working hard, by getting the right positive attentions, and therefore academically succeeding as well, where they'll get even more praise. Their values are aligned with and the same as those of the school, and that's what forms a pro-school subculture. On the other hand, if you've been streamed in a negative way, then you might form an anti-school subculture or be part of an anti-school subculture. And those placed in the low streams, who tend to, as we know, to be working class, lose a little bit of their self-esteem. They've been put in a position of inferior status, okay, and even physically outside of the classroom of their peers who have got a superior status. The label of failure pushes them to look for alternative ways of achieving status. And this usually involves inverting the school's values, in other words, breaking the rules, rejecting, criticising, or even sabotaging the school's approach to hard work, obedience, punctuality, and so on. Now, forming anti-school subcultures is a way of gaining status amongst their peers, and it's likely to become a self-fulfilling prophecy as pupils continue to look for status by behaving badly and not working in the way that the school wants them to. And, of course, what also will happen is often these students will fail educationally. So have a little think now, what could be done to avoid these subcultures from forming and occurring in schools? Now, if it's as simple as being caused by streaming, then one thing you might consider is to abolish streaming. Well, you're not the first person to have thought of this. This is something that has been tried in various comprehensive schools, and Stephen Ball in 1981 found that a school that was in the process of abolishing streaming and bringing about mixed ability groups to try and narrow that gap. This is what he found. He found that basically the basis for pupils to polarise had been taken away, and therefore without streams you had far fewer anti-school subcultures. So far so good. However, differentiation did still occur. Even though there weren't streams, teachers would still continue to label middle class and working class students differently to one another. The positive labelling of middle class students resulted in better exam results, indicating that self-fulfilling prophecies had occurred. Since this study, streaming has not only increased in prevalence, but there are now different types of schools as well, some of which work towards a more academic curriculum compared to the others. So it can be argued that this has actually increased the opportunities for students to be differentiated, and of course, as soon as you're widening differentiation, you're also widening the inequality or increasing inequality. Now, I asked you how students might respond to streaming or being part of a subculture, an anti-school subculture. Okay, other than to form an anti-school subculture, and there are ways of responding that studies have been made of by Peter Woods. He said that other ways that students could respond was firstly through ingratiation. So in other words, you become the teacher's pet as a way of kind of showing how much on board you are with the school's values. That would obviously be part of the middle class groups. For more working class groups, maybe get through school by a process of ritualism, just staying out of trouble, going through the motions, completing as much as they can, but with little sort of manoeuvring away from what's expected. Retreatism, so kind of going inward to yourself, daydreaming, mucking about in class, not really engaging with the tasks. And of course, outright rejection of everything the school stands for. And Woods refers to this response as rebellion. And this study was continued further, and Furlong found that pupils actually respond differently and move between their responses within the school and even within perhaps in any given day. So the way that some students behaved or responded to their labelling and self-fulfilling prophecies might be different with one teacher than it was another. And you may have found that yourself, that there were some classes that you got on really well with and others where perhaps your behaviour wasn't ideal. So just to kind of finish off on labelling theory, most of these arguments that we've put forward so far are really influenced almost directly by labelling theory, whether that's to do with streaming or self-fulfilling prophecies or anti-school subcultures. It all stems from the teachers negatively making assumptions about their working class students. Now, these are really a set of useful examples and arguments that can be used as a way of challenging the cultural deprivation theorists, whose starting points that schools are neutral and fair institutions, and that inequality comes from external factors, can really be, if you like, combated with any of the theories that we looked at in this session. However, labelling theory itself is not without its own criticisms. So let's kind of not quite debunk it, but look at some of these criticisms of labelling theory as a way of maybe using them as evaluation in a lesson. The first criticism is that labelling theory can often be accused of being deterministic. In other words, it makes the assumption that the labelling working class pupils will experience will have no choice but to fail and live up to the self-fulfilling prophecy. It doesn't really give them much sense of agency. Marxists would suggest that labelling ignores the wider structures of power in which the labelling takes place. It tends to, if we see that the cultural deprivation theories tend to blame the victim, then these labelling theories tend to simply blame the teachers, for labelling students. But it doesn't explain why they might do that. It doesn't really give us, none of the labelling theories gives us much of an insight as to what is driving teachers to do this. And they expand this criticism to look at the fact that labelling wouldn't necessarily occur because of individual prejudices, because, what about all the teachers that come from working class backgrounds? There are plenty of them out there, so they don't hold prejudiced views about working class kids, but instead it's argued that this comes from the system, that the education system as part of an unequal society should be to blame, not the teachers individually. So we move away from labelling theory now and look at the last couple of ideas about how an individual's class identity might have an impact on their educational achievement. So we've looked at labelling and subcultures. Sociologists are interested in how pupils' class identities that are formed outside the school can interact with the processes in the school. So I just want you to think about in the ways in which a student's class identity that is formed outside of the school can have an impact on the experiences they have inside the school. And the answer to this is really all to do with something known as habitus. Now, habitus is an idea developed by Pierre Bourdieu in 1984. He developed a lot of other theories that we've looked at already and talked about with things like social capital and whatnot. But habitus refers to the ways of thinking, the behaviours, the actions, the attitudes that are taken for granted by certain classes. It can be revealed by their tastes and lifestyle choices in regards to their hobbies, their fashion choices, as well as what their expectations about what is normal and realistic for the group are as well. So now you've got an idea of what habitus is. Have a think about what some of the differences are between the middle class and working class habitus in terms of their lifestyles and their expectations and so on. So to give you an idea of what the answer to that question would be, you may want to write some of these ideas down on the back of a page somewhere in your booklet, But whereas the working class habitus tends to have values such as immediate gratification or working, living life in the moment, working to the present, Obviously, conversely, middle class habitus is about planning for the future, enjoying the sort of being able to have deferred gratification, also things like flexibility and sort of being open to change and things like that is considered to be part of middle class habitus, whereas where more working class habitus is sort of living on a sort of day to day, making ends meet, and so on. And of course, all of these ideas and ways in which people live their life based on their habitus feeds into the school, because the middle classes in society are able to use the influence that they have, the power that they have in society, to actually impose the middle class habitus on our education system. And what this means is, of course, that schools in the UK will have a middle class habitus, which obviously is a disadvantage to the working class students. But before we get there with that, let's have a think about why life in school might be considered being part of a middle class habitus. Well, there are a number of things we could have put on this. You could talk about the language codes. So of course, we mentioned in part one how teachers and have expectations that students will use the elaborated code when they're speaking. The overall pursuit of academia, but also the idea of focusing on long-term goals, part of a middle-class habitus. The belief in a meritocratic system whereby you can achieve more than your peers and that you should fight for your own success individually is part of school life. The reward system, of schools can often be part of a middle-class habitus as well. And unsurprisingly, as a consequence, middle-class pupils are at an advantage because the habitus that they feel in schools will not be a million miles from the one that they experience at home. This is quite a good moment to think about actually how similar some of these ideas are when it comes to cultural capital that Pierre Bourdieu talked about. Of course, there is a complete link between the middle class habitus of a school and the expectations and the parental support that students would get that Bourdieu is talking about with cultural capital. So now we're going to discuss something called symbolic capital and symbolic violence. Basically, this is a result of middle class habitus at schools, is that some pupils will get the recognition and status and be judged to be worth and have value to the school, whilst other students, the working class students, are devalued and perceived as adding no worth or no value to the school. So this term symbolic capital is about students who enjoy, is a capital that is enjoyed by middle class students who feel accepted, they feel at home in their educational environment. That's that kind of symbolic capital that they can feel almost as though nothing is different between school and home. And then there's something called symbolic violence. And this is what is felt by the working class students, where there is a kind of clash between their own habitus and that of the schools. And as a consequence, working class experience of schools can be quite demeaning or alienating or even feel very unnatural. So a question would be, well, how do students respond to this symbolic violence? Now, one obvious way, you might think, would be to form subcultures, break the rules, start rebelling, or maybe even to retreat into daydreaming or other forms of troublemaking. But there has been some fascinating studies on this, and again, a very well-known one is known as Nike identities, and this was Archer's theory. What the theory looks at is how symbolic violence leads to working class pupils looking for other ways of creating self-worth and value and status. If they're not getting it from teachers and the school itself, they will find other ways of achieving status within that school environment. And how it often revealed itself, if you like, was by investing in certain types of styles, especially through sort of consuming branded clothing. This is where the name Nike identities come from. Often it was, prestige clothing wear or something that represented consumable goods like Nike. And these brands were absolutely key to pupils understanding each other's social status, with effectively students would be policing each other to make sure that they were conforming, and anyone outside of that particular branded identity would perhaps be stigmatized or even perhaps bullied. But of course, at the same time, by constructing a new identity, one that's based on consumer goods and style and clothing, what this meant was that often ran into conflict with the dress code of the school itself. So this was kind of where students would be sort of seen as an adoption of style that would be more appropriate for perhaps streetwear and obviously away from the habitus of the school. What Louise Archer argues is that these sort of performances are really little more than a struggle for recognition, but ultimately they were looked down on as being kind of tasteless or overly consumerist by their middle class peers. Have a think back to your own time in school and also, in education, as to how do pupils use branded goods as a way of shaping and exhibiting their identity, and of course, as a way of achieving status. So moving on, looking at continuing how pupils' class identities can have an impact, but we'll move into an area that we've not really looked at in this session, and that's how it impacts on higher education. So Archer's work found that the Nike identities played a part in how working class pupils view higher education as well, and why they are more likely to reject the idea of going to university. Instead, their working class identity meant that they would see education as two things. First of all, they'd see it as unrealistic, because their strong identity makes them feel as though it's not really for people like them, but they would see it as perhaps as for people who are richer and maybe posher people. Assumes that working class students would assume that university is something that they wouldn't fit into, and actually that it would be quite a risky and unaffordable venture. The other thing they noted was that higher education was deemed to be undesirable because it wouldn't suit their preferred lifestyle or even their habitus. For example, the expenses attached to university would make it more difficult to afford the styles that had given them their identity in the first place. So this, again, this sort of feedback loop, or if you like, this cycle of educational underachievement by working class pupils continues, and it becomes cyclical when they don't want to go to university and therefore can't get those higher grades as well. A case study was done on this, unsurprisingly, Sarah Evans in 2009. Okay, and this is really a response to the fact that even though there are more working class people from ever before that are attending universities, there is still seen that class background can be a barrier to success. Evans found, for example, that working class pupils from London that were studying A-levels were completely reluctant to apply for the elite universities such as Oxford and Cambridge, and that's because they weren't necessarily worried about the debt, they were more worried that they wouldn't fit in. Now Evans, like other theorists such as Archer, also found that girls had, in particular, but also boys, had a strong sense of attachment to their locality and were often reluctant to move away for university. Again, we can link that to some of the working class subcultures discussed in the external factors where that collectivism is so important. Diane Ray and others pointed out that this self-exclusion from elite universities limits the potential that they have for success. So let's finish up with some ideas as to how we can connect to all the stuff that we've looked at on these lessons in social class. But first of all, have a little think about this question. What do you think has the greatest impact on a pupil's chance of success? Do you think it's the external factors from their home life, things like their language or the parental interest? Do you think it's their material factors, such as their lack of money or access to support and so on? Or do you think it's the internal factors we've studied today, the things that we've said are attached to the school, teacher labelling, for example, self-fulfilling prophecies, forming subcultures? Let's take a little, before we kind of answer that question, let's have a little look at a recap of some of the stuff you've considered here. The working class habitus and identity that the pupils are socialised with at home is an external factor, and they are in conflict with the middle class habitus that is favoured at school, which is an internal factor. Working class pupils will learn and use restricted speech codes, which, as we know, is an external factor, which then may be used against them whereas they are labelled by teachers who will consider them to be less able and leading to a self-fulfilling prophecy, which of course is an internal factor. Pupils who live in poverty and have material deprivation, which of course is an external factor, may then be the victims of bullying and stigmatisation, which could lead to poor attendance. So that's an internal factor if it's not dealt with correctly. And then finally, the marketisation of education, the emphasis on A to C's for a success at school might seem like it's an internal factor, but we would consider it an external factor because it's beyond even the control of the school themselves. It's to do with government policy and those who make the big decisions. So if that's an external factor, the impact is on how teachers will interact with students and maybe limit their success if they decide to throw a bunch of students into the lower set and another bunch into the higher set, because they're hoping to get those crucial 5 A to C's for the school. And so just to kind of give you an exam tip really, that first question I asked, well, the underachievement is likely to be a product of all 4 of those factors. All of these factors that we've looked at, not just the external ones, not just the internal ones. And so knowing all of them is really useful to be part of an evaluation, because evaluations can be looking at arguments that can contradict one another, but they can also be arguments that complement what theories you put already. So finally, here's 7 quick consolidation questions. You have room in your booklet to answer those, okay? And also in the booklet are some practice for a 30-mark question as well, which is obviously the big one on the paper 1 education section. Okay, well that's that wrapped up. Thank you very much for listening and filling in your booklet as well. And this will conclude the stuff on social class and the gap in achievement between working class and middle class students. Thanks very much.